Good day, everyone. I hope you are all doing well and are safe from this pandemic. I am Mr. Ahdrian Senden, and on behalf of my co-author, Ms. Windie Odoño, I will be presenting our paper entitled The Philippines Road to Recovery from the Pandemic, GDP, Debt, and Expenditures. Content of this presentation are as follows: the introduction, methodology, results, discussion, and lastly, the recommendations. The gross domestic product or the GDP of the Philippines increases annually. But in 2020, with the onset of novel coronavirus 2019, the country's GDP contracted by a whopping 9.57% from 19 trillion pesos in 2019 down to 17.7 trillion pesos in 2020. And along with that decrease in GDP, the country's debt ballooned to 10 trillion pesos in 2020. That is a 2 trillion increase from 2019's 8 trillion pesos debt. Also, the government debt to GDP ratio in 2019 was at 42.41%. But as for 2020, it is at 58.50%. That is an increase of more than 16%, 16.09% to be exact. And with that, this begs the question, is the Philippine government using the debts the country is incurring to mitigate the economic slump brought by the pandemic? For the methodology, the paper uses two regression equations. The first equation is inspired by the work of Berger and Kalitz in 2021, published in the South African Journal of Economics. It measures the immediate or short-run impact of an increase in government expenditure on economic growth, where G sub T is the annual real economic growth rate, E sub T over Y sub T is the total government expenditure to GDP ratio, and X sub T is the annual real growth rate in government expenditure. For the second equation, it measures whether increasing debt to GDP ratio increases the government expenditure to GDP ratio needed for economic growth, where G sub T is the annual real economic growth rate. D sub T over Y sub T is the total government debt to GDP ratio. And lastly, X sub T is the annual real growth rate in government expenditure. All data used in this paper came from the Philippine Statistics Authority and from the Bureau of Treasury. As for the results, Table 1 presents the results of equation 1. It shows that real growth in total government expenditure has a positive impact on real economic growth with a coefficient of 0.2599, which indicates that a 1% increase in total government expenditure leads to a 0.2599% increase in real economic growth. While Table 2 shows that the government expenditure to GDP ratio reacts negatively to increasing the debt to GDP ratio. A 1% increase in the debt to GDP ratio leads to a 0.1284% decrease in government expenditure. The result is significant at alpha 0.1. On the other hand, the GDP growth rate exhibits a positive effect on government expenditure to GDP ratio. A 1% increase in GDP growth rate leads to a 0.0377% increase in government spending. With the results, we have established that the government expenditure to GDP ratio has a positive impact on real economic growth. And a boost in government spending can jumpstart the economy and act as the first line of defense or buffer to protect the nation from an economic downturn. Also, based on the second equation, the government debt to GDP ratio negatively affects government expenditure to GDP ratio. It can also be inferred that government debt is not being used to fund government expenditures or is not being utilized for meaningful government spending. For the recommendations, further studies should be made with more extensive data to estimate the optimal government expenditure to GDP ratio level. Since we also acknowledge that excessive spending can also lead to improper allocation of government funds. Next, put in place mechanisms that will provide the availability of information about where government debts are going. The public should be made aware of where borrowed funds are being used, since ultimately they are the ones that will pay for those borrowings. Furthermore, studies about debt, expenditure, economic growth, and GDP will be proven useful, especially after the pandemic and the world is recovering from the damages of this dire situation. And that would be all. Thank you for listening. Have a great day ahead. Thank you.